Hello and welcome back again to our presentation on European integration in Southeast Europe. And in this segment, I want to talk about conditionality and the process of integration that is carried out on the basis of conditions that come from the European Union. There is a lot of discussion of conditionality and about the imposition of conditions. Some of it is a bit mystified and mystifying. There appears to be, if you follow media reports, a lack of clarity about what conditions are. In fact, although they're flexible in practice, there is not a lot of lack of clarity about what the conditions for accession to the European Union are. They are contained in a document called the acquis communautaire. That is, it sets out all of the expectations that the European Union has of candidate states and states that want to become candidate states, the changes that they are expected to make in order to harmonize their own legislation and their own practices and their own institutions with European institutions. There are 35 chapters in the acquis communautaire. We are looking now at a list of chapters, including the first 10. You notice the first 9 of these 10 are all basically about exchange, freedom of movement, harmonization of basic legislation. You don't really have a very contentious one until you get to number 10 about information and media, which is a sticking point in many negotiations. Here are the next 10 chapters, chapters 11 to 20. Many of these are technical, so chapter 11 is about agriculture, chapter 13 is about fisheries, which is sometimes an object of contention because it has to do with market share, but mostly these are technical harmonization issues. The most contentious chapters tend to be the ones that come in the last bit. Those include chapters like chapter 23 on the judiciary and fundamental rights, chapter 24 on justice, freedom, and security, which includes expectations for equality and guarantees against discrimination, chapters 30 and 31 on harmonization of foreign policy and of security and defense policy and external relations of the European Union. Just for good measure, here are the final 5 chapters, and it includes also chapter 35. This is an undefined chapter in which can be put any issues that arise during negotiation that appear to be resolved. Now, this is a place, especially in those contentious chapters, places where it might appear as though frequently states do not meet the conditions that are expected by the European Union on issues having to do with media freedom, with culture, with rule of law, with harmonization of foreign and defense policy, where the official narrative that conditionality involves major changes in values, practices, and standards, which are put forward as conditions, but which states adopt willingly because they recognize it is in their interest, may tend to break down. And this is because standards like freedom of media or minority rights or guarantees for the independence of the judiciary or rule of law or harmonized policy are not always in the interest of state elites, especially to the degree that those state elites tend toward authoritarianism and corruption, seeking to maintain their position of advantage. And this is why the process of states meeting conditions tends to be slow and tends to run into problems. What are some of these problems? First, there is a perception, in particular on the part of the ruling group in states, that the conditions that are imposed tend to escalate and tend to intensify. Second, the degree to which the European Commission is satisfied or dissatisfied with progress toward achieving goals will tend to vary. It depends upon the political consensus that exists within the Commission, and this is itself subject to the changing politics and the strategies for protection of power that are engaged by individual states that are members of the Union. So that we know, for example, there are some states that have become members of the European Union without meeting all of the conditions that are set out in the acquis communautaire. There are some states that have met conditions, but their candidacies have not been advancing. This is in particular a point of contention in the accession of Macedonia, where a number of efforts have been made to satisfy conditions in the expectation that there would be a response on the part of the European Union, but those responses have been blocked. This happens, I think, also largely because you have these 35 chapters in the acquis, and it makes it appear as though the measurements of compliance with conditionality are largely formal. Questions like, have the appropriate laws been adopted that are expected? But these measurements are not so much, or they run into trouble with, there is an effort to make them substantive. That is to ask whether the laws have been accompanied by actual changes in practices and standards in the countries involved. A further complicating factor arises from the politics of the European Union itself, in particular the repeated difficulties that the European Union has run into with states that are already member states that have elected populist or authoritarian regimes that tend to resist the standards, and there is dispute over whether the European Union responds to the challenges that are presented to it by these developments with an appropriate commitment to their own standards. That is, the question is repeatedly raised that these fundamental values of Europe, the things that in the last segment we said are at the core of the appeal of Europe, there is a question about how committed Europe is to the values of Europe. So in sum, the process of conditioned integration into Europe is a political process that is made more complicated because it takes on the appearance of being a technical process. Now, this is an issue also that tends to become more important over time. And that's because the power of the European Union to impose its conditions since enlargement began has depended on asymmetry. The European Union was larger, richer, more prestigious, and more powerful than any of the states that were candidates or potential candidates. It also enjoyed, most of the time, sort of, a close alliance with the United States, so there was a consensus across the so-called West, and there were no serious competitors for influence in the region to the European Union. The persuasiveness of these advantages has tended to diminish over time, and what this means is that in recent years, the European Union has been in the unfamiliar position of having to make a case for its own superiority, that is, to make a case for a point that seemed initially to be obvious. As far as this involves the candidate states, there are reasons for them to be not all that displeased with the erosion of the European Union's monopolistic position. Political leadership tends to calculate that recent developments, especially the emergence of competitors for influence to the European Union, tends to reduce their exposure to economic harm, could in the long run have the effect of reducing the intensity of demands that are imposed by conditionality, and might allow them to gain some political advantage by playing the European Union against other influential economic and political actors, such as Russia and China, and in recent years probably also the United States. Now, add to this also the difficulty that the European Union faces in maintaining its own standards internally among states that are already member states when it's faced with right-wing populist regimes among its current members. And what you get is a situation where this process of conditionality, a process that is designed to look mechanistic and commonsensical and inevitable, runs into a number of difficulties that tends to make the process longer and more uncertain, both for the European Union and for the states that are trying to achieve their goal of membership.